Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 31 in our History Bites series. Today we will be discussing the arduous and monumental task of building the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. America's first steam locomotive made its debut in 1830, and over the next 2 decades, railroad tracks linked many cities on the East Coast. By 1850, some 9,000 miles of track had been laid east of the Missouri River. During that same period, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States. This trend increased dramatically after the discovery of gold in California in 1849. The overland journey across mountains, plains, rivers, and deserts was risky and difficult, and many westward migrants instead chose to travel by sea, taking an 18,000-mile 4 to 8 month journey around Cape Horn at the tip of South America. The other option risked yellow fever, cholera, and malaria by crossing the Isthmus of Panama and traveling via ship to San Francisco. In 1845, New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney, known as the father of railroads, presented a resolution in Congress proposing the federal funding of a railroad that would stretch to the Pacific. Lobbying efforts over the next several years failed due to growing sectionalism in Congress, but the idea remained a potent one. In 1849, he drafted a map proposing western routes starting from Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, to ports in Puget Sound and San Francisco. In 1860, a young engineer named Theodore Judah identified the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California, where a group of westward immigrants had become trapped in 1846, as an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1861, Judah had enlisted a group of investors in Sacramento to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. He then headed to Washington, where he was able to convince congressional leaders, as well as President Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law the following year. The Pacific Railroad Act stipulated that the Central Pacific Railroad Company would start building in Sacramento and continue east across the Sierra Nevada, while a second company, the Union Pacific Railroad, would build westward from the Missouri River near the Iowa-Nebraska border. The 2 lines of track would meet in the middle, although the bill did not designate an exact location, and each company would receive 6,400 acres of land, later doubled to 12,800, and $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track built. From the beginning, then, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was set up in terms of a competition between the 2 companies. In the West, the Central Pacific would be dominated by the Big Four: Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. All were ambitious businessmen with no prior experience with railroads, engineering, or construction. They borrowed heavily to finance the project and exploited legal loopholes to get the most possible funds from the government for their planned track construction. Disillusioned with his partners, Judah planned to recruit new investors to buy them out, but he caught yellow fever while crossing the Isthmus of Panama on his way east and died in November 1863, soon after the Central Pacific had spiked its first rails to ties in Sacramento. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Dr. Thomas Durant had illegally achieved a controlling interest in the Union Pacific Railroad Company, giving him complete authority over the project. Though the Union Pacific celebrated its own launch in early December 1863, little would be completed until the end of the Civil War in 1865. After General Grenville Dodge, a hero of the Union Army, took control as chief engineer, the Union Pacific finally began to move westward in May 1866. Still, the Union Pacific moved relatively quickly across the plains compared to the slow progress of their rival company through the Sierra. It was difficult for the Central Pacific to retain workers in California because the gold fields lured men away from railroad work. But in 1864, the company experimented with Chinese workers and found these immigrants to be hardworking and reliable. Building on this success, the Central Pacific hired as many as 15,000 Chinese immigrants in 1865 to 1869, who formed about 80% of the total workforce. While Chinese and Irish workers were paid close to the same wages per day, the Chinese were not compensated for food and had to purchase it themselves. By contrast, the workforce of the Union Pacific was mainly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. By the summer of 1867, the Union Pacific was in Wyoming, having covered nearly 4 times as much ground as the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific broke through the mountains in late June, however, and the hard part was finally behind them. To blast through the mountains, the Central Pacific built huge wooden trestles on the western slopes and used gunpowder and nitroglycerin to blast tunnels through the granite. Both companies then headed towards Salt Lake City, cutting many corners, including building shoddy bridges or sections of track that would have to be rebuilt later, in their race to get ahead. By early 1869, the companies were working only miles from each other, and in March, the newly inaugurated President Ulysses S. Grant announced he would withhold federal funds until the 2 railroad companies agreed on a meeting point. They decided on Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake, some 690 track miles from Sacramento and 1,086 from Omaha. On May 10th, after several delays, a crowd of workers and dignitaries watched as the final spike was driven, linking the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific in the Golden Spike ceremony. The Golden Spike was made of 17.6 karat gold and was a gift of David Hughes, a San Francisco contractor and friend of Big Four member Leland Stanford. During the ceremony, Stanford took the first swing at the spike, but accidentally struck the tie instead. His attempt was followed by Union Pacific Thomas Durant's. Durant swung and missed. A railroad worker ultimately drove the final spike at 12:47 p.m. on May 10, 1869. Telegraph cables immediately went out to President Grant and around the country with the news that the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad opened up the American West to more rapid development. With the completion of the track, the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States was cut from a matter of months to under a week. It cost $136 for first class in a Pullman sleeping car, $110 for second class, and $65 for a space on a third or emigrant class bench. Connecting the 2 American coasts made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier than ever before. The railroad also facilitated westward expansion, escalating conflicts between Native American tribes and settlers who now had easier access to new territories. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.